All right. Before we get started, I know that you don't have this specific stuff. We talked about Luke and Barnabas and Titus and Timothy and all of them. I'm trying to figure out an efficient way to print everything, and I'm trying to debate on whether or not to kind of do it in like a pamphlet or like a packet in a binder. I've known some churches that have done that when they make their own material. They have like a binder and then they just put it in there and hand it out. So I'm kind of thinking, because it's going to be a lot of paper, that I'm thinking maybe we could do it that way. So I'm holding off printing any new notes for today, at least anyway, until I can kind of really figure out exactly the best way to do it. So forgive me that there's no new notes yet. I don't want to print out more notes and then figure out, okay, well, we're going to do a binder type thing and then have to reprint everything. So hopefully this week I'll figure out exactly how we're going to do it. Okay, so last week, as I mentioned, we talked about Titus, Timothy, Barnabas, John Mark, and Luke. Those are the five. Those are five of the individuals who were helping with the teaching of the gospel outside of the apostles. But they were working closely with the apostles to teach the gospel. Certainly they weren't the only five, but certainly there were others. But those are probably the main five that we're most familiar with. We recognize their names right off the bat. Then we discussed some major persecutions sanctioned by the government of Rome. Again, this is outside of the purview of Jewish persecution. This is not also taking into account Gentiles just getting mad at the Christians because they're teaching about one God. This is Roman sanctioned persecution from Caesars or allowing it to go through. Last week we ended discussing Pliny there in under C. I'm sorry, not C, F. Pliny the Younger. With Trajan. Trajan was the last Caesar that we discussed. He ended his reign around 117. So he reigned for a while. But as we talked about under Pliny the Younger, there was a test, kind of a testing that was done. And of course, Trajan responded, listen, don't seek out Christians, but if you find them and they refuse to worship or offer a sacrifice to our gods, then you can prosecute them. And that's what he did. We talked about this particular test that he divined. Those who persisted in confessing they were Christians he had executed, or Roman citizens sent to Rome. Those who denied they were Christians he subjected to the test of invoking the gods, offering them incense and a libation in the presence of an image of the emperor, and cursing Christ. And so that was one of the tests by which if somebody claimed, well, I was a Christian, but I'm not anymore, then you have to do this. And of course, you kind of wonder how many of these certainly would not have done so or certainly been forthcoming about being the fact, no, I am a Christian and I will not do this. And so how many of them may have actually been kind of like the seed sown on the stony places, that as soon as they were faced with the prospect of potentially being killed, perhaps they decided, well, I'll do this. God understands. I'll just go ahead and curse the name of Christ and offer this to a false god, and no big deal. Obviously, that's not the case. So we see that Trajan responded at the bottom that the problem could only be dealt with case by case. The authorities were not to seek Christians out, but people who were denounced and found guilty were to be punished unless by worshiping the Roman gods they proved they were not Christians, having denied Christ, and so obtained pardon. Anonymous denunciations were to be ignored. And that's about as far as we got last week. So we're in the midst of talking about persecutions from Rome, and there are two major after Nero and really Pliny the Younger. This doesn't even count as one of the major persecutions. Really, there were three major ones through up until Constantinople. There was Nero's persecution against the saints. Then, of course, we talked a little bit about Domitian, and we've talked about Trajan. Those aren't considered one of the major times of persecution. And then as we go forward, we're going to notice these other two. Under G, Christians who refuse to recant by performing ceremonies to honor the gods would meet with severe penalties. Roman citizens were exiled or condemned to a swift death by beheading. Slaves, foreign-born residents, and lower classes were liable to be put to death by wild beasts as a public spectacle. A variety of animals were used for those condemned to die in this way. There is no evidence for Christians being executed at the Colosseum in Rome during this period, because the Colosseum, it wasn't built until around mid-100s. I forget the exact date. It's like 120 something or 130 something. So this is not including this particular time period under Pliny the Younger. So this is kind of how they dealt with people who failed the test or refused to recant the name of Jesus. In particular, and we talked before about the two situations that Christians were facing. False accusations, people who were repeating that Christians were guilty of this or that. And as a result, it seemed like Christians, with these false accusations, it seemed Christians started coming up or bringing out this reputation, I guess. And that's why we talked before last week about how people who had denounced Christianity, at least they stood up and said, listen, Christians aren't guilty of the things that they're being condemned for and being accused of. So whatever those accusations specifically were, they weren't guilty of it. And I imagine that if it wasn't something that was completely baseless or false, that it probably had something to do with the failure to worship the gods of Rome or worship Caesar. In that, similarly to what the Jews said about Jesus, that, hey, he's holding himself up against Caesar, he is a threat to Caesar. There may have been some kind of overlap with that, with the Christians in Rome and in the Roman Empire as well. That these Christians, they believe in a different king, and they believe in the destruction of Rome, and they believe in taking up arms and fighting against the Romans. Obviously they didn't, but you could see how that could kind of snowball into that idea. So that's possibly one of those false accusations as well. Anything through G? All right, H. There were two all-out empire-wide persecutions. So this is not including the Nero situation with Nero. There were two all-out empire-wide persecutions intended to utterly destroy the church. The first, under the Emperor Decius, began in December 249 AD. Everyone in the empire had to get a certificate from a government officer verifying that he or she had offered a sacrifice to the gods, an act that most Christians in good conscience could not do. Given the fact, and of course, all empires, all governments since time immemorial have taken a census to understand how many people do we have, what type of people do we have, all that stuff. So you got to figure that when the Roman Empire, they had an understanding, that they were very well organized. That was one thing about the Roman Empire, at least until they started to fall apart. They had the means of understanding exactly the type of people living in their empire. So when they sent out this decree and commanded that every person, not just every citizen, but every person in the empire, they had to be certified or at least being certified as including in their worship the Roman gods. Okay, again, as we mentioned last week, it wasn't that they worshiped Jehovah. That wasn't really the main issue. The main issue was that it was only Jehovah, and it didn't include any of the gods of Rome or Caesar. Okay, that the whole monotheism, the emphasis being there on the mono, that, if you include Jehovah in your worship, that's fine. But if you only worship Jehovah to the exclusion of all others, that was the issue. And so this is the first, I don't say that the Roman Empire declared war on the church, but this was a threat to them, or at least that's how it was perceived, was that Christians were a threat. Their belief in a one God was a threat. And of course, remember, by 249, the gospel's continuing to spread. Okay, and it is permeating society. As of really 100 AD, it was already permeating. We know of at least two churches in Rome or around Rome at the seat of Caesar's power in 100 AD. So by 249, certainly there's even more momentum, more spreading of the gospel. And so because of the teaching of the one God, that certainly would be considered a threat. And certainly I wouldn't be at all surprised if some of the motivations behind this on the Caesar's end isn't that, many of these Caesars like to be worshipped as God, or the thought process that when they died they became a god, and certainly the idea that there's only one God and sorry Caesar, you're not it, certainly probably would not have been good for his ego. So that may have played a part as well. Thoughts through H? Okay, this would be similar to, obviously we don't necessarily have a whole bunch of, we do, but not like the Romans and the Greeks having a pantheon of gods in America. But it would be kind of like if our government somehow, some way were to change how it works, religious freedom was thrown out the window, and all of a sudden, when we go get our driver's license, or what do we do every year, pay our taxes or whatever, we also have to certify that we're an atheist, that we don't believe in God, we're an atheist, and we have to either make that claim before a judge or sign our name to it or whatever. It's something we do every year. So you can imagine how Christians, they would have had to make a clear choice. Either you say, no, I'm not going to sign that, or in this case, no, I'm not going to offer this sacrifice or get this certificate, or you're going to, but then you have to look yourself in the mirror every day knowing from that point on, if you haven't fallen away at that point, that I denied that I was a Christian. And of course, at no point in the New Testament do we ever find anyone the approved example of a Christian denying Christ just to get away without having to endure persecution. At no point do we ever see that. So the idea, the thought process, well, I'll just say I deny him, but in reality I'm still a Christian, that doesn't fly in the example of the New Testament. Okay, if you're able to escape the persecution, that's one thing, but you don't before governments, before powers, and before people, you don't give that example. You don't say, I deny him, and then secretly you really are. That's not the example we have. So anything through H. All right. I. This is the second great all-out, in essence, persecution, called the Great Persecution, began on February 23rd, 303, under Emperor Diocletian. Galerius, the empire's second in command, was behind this persecution policy and continued it after Diocletian's death. For 8 long years, official decrees ordered Christians out of public office, scriptures confiscated, church buildings destroyed, leaders arrested, and pagan sacrifices required. All the reliable methods of torture were mercilessly employed: wild beasts, burning, stabbing, crucifixion, and the rack. They were all to no avail. The penetration of the faith across the empire was so pervasive that the church could not be intimidated nor destroyed. In 311, the same Galerius, shortly before his death, weak and diseased, issued an edict of toleration. This included the statement that it was the duty of Christians to pray to their God for our good estate. So for 8 years, okay, this wasn't just a 1 year type of thing or for a couple of months. For 8 years, there was an all-out public policy against Christians. In fact, when I read this particular segment, I really thought a lot about the Jews in the Holocaust in Germany, okay, especially leading up to all-out war in World War II. How that seems kind of very similar, at least in terms of the means of kicking out of public office, getting them out of any positions of power or whatnot, and then all out killing them, really, we see here. That Christians faced this as far back as the 300s. So, thoughts or comments through I? Okay. Now, after 300, or well, about 350, I forget the exact date, when Constantinople was converted to Christianity, made Christianity the official religion of Rome. But after that point, it's not that Christianity had a good time, and it certainly isn't that men didn't use the name Christian in a means to justify their own ends. Of course, going forward, there were the Crusades. You had the Spanish Inquisition. You had different, and of course there were obviously different elements, different churches and church belief systems at that point that were part of all of that were using Scripture to justify their own means, religion, and we'll talk about those eventually. But after 300, it's not that Christianity wasn't persecuted, but because Christianity in so many different forms started branching out, it was much, much harder for an organized resistance against Christianity as a whole. Okay. Again, that's not to say, I mean, even today, there are certain countries where Christians are still persecuted and the teaching of the Bible is forbidden. So that it's not like it's ever stopped. It hasn't. But in terms of trying to nip it in the bud, so to speak, if Satan was attempting to stop it before it could really get going, as of 350, that there was no more. That's it. It's done. It's going to continue. So, anything else through I? Yes, sir.
A couple of thoughts. One, if you were a Christian back in those times, the easy thing would have been, like Jonah, head a different direction. I'll be a Christian, but go 1,000 miles that way.
Yeah.
Outside the Roman Empire. You
Yeah.
have Paul made an appeal to go directly to the seat of Caesar. You would take that. And then as a consequence of that, you think about the Christians having to make these kinds of decisions. Paul writes, those of Caesar's household sending greetings. So there were some people there that would really have to make a tough decision.
Tough choices.
Come down very heavy on them, you would think.
Right, absolutely. Anything else on that? There was, when you mentioned that, I thought about the letters to the 7 churches of Asia in Revelation chapter 2, chapter 3. And Jesus' consistent and persistent warnings about the persecutions to come, that this wasn't going to be just a one-time overnight thing. Okay, there was going to be continued persecution against the saints. And of course, in the late 90s AD, when this was written by John to the 7 churches of Asia, it was only about 10 short years from that point that we see Pliny the Younger come on the scene and this whole test to see whether or not you're a Christian and if you've recanted your Christianity and so forth. All of that started not long. And of course, certainly Christians were being persecuted along the way anyway. But in terms of public Roman government sanctioned persecution, Jesus, he said, this is coming, and you have to be prepared for it. To he who overcomes, to all the churches, to he who overcomes, this is what I'll do. This is what I'll give you. And so that motivation was meant to be in their minds as they were facing those tests. And whether or not are you going to be willing to offer a sacrifice to the gods? Are you going to be willing to go get this certificate later in 249? That certainly would have been something that had to be on their minds, is the promise of the gospel, the promise of Christ. If I overcome, no matter what man does to me, I have the promise of Christ. Anything else through I? Yes, sir.
I'm reminded also of the verse we just went through, and we talked about on Wednesday evening about the wise man in a city versus all the
10 rulers
or an army or whatever.
Yep.
So how are you going to fight the Roman Empire? Not by raising up an army of physical soldiers, but as it noted, the faith that was so strong, that seed planted, that it couldn't be rooted out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and as we ended last week in our class, Danny Simmons brought up the question about persecution and its effect in terms of spreading the gospel, and how would we kind of face that today, and if is persecution needed for us today? And I think to a certain extent there are phases, it seems like, that the church goes through in different parts of the world. And certainly in America we've been extremely blessed for the last 300 years or so, where for the most part Christianity has been left alone. That may continue for another 300 years, or it may soon cease. But one way or the other, whether it's in our lives every day and without the outward persecution, we still have to make that decision to serve as a Christian and be an example. The difference is that when persecution is applied, it forces us to make a decision. And a lot of times what happens is you have people who consider themselves Christians. This is, again, the very same thing Jesus described in the parable of the sower, that while it's easy and while it fits my well-being, I'll claim I'm a Christian and I'll do pretty much what I'm supposed to do. But then as soon as it gets difficult and adversity arises, it's not worth it. Okay, and whether that happens in our lifetimes or it happens, if it ever happens again here in America anyway, before Christ returns, that is certainly one of those testing by fire that tests the faith of Christians. So it's worth, I hope it's worth all of us considering how strong is my faith. And if I had to make that choice and make that decision, would I offer sacrifices to the gods? Would I sign my name that I'm an atheist? Would I do that, or would I be willing to face, burning, stabbing, wild beasts, crucifixion, the rack? Would I be willing to face that? Because Christians did face it. Our brethren in Christ from 1,700 years ago faced it. Anything else through talking about the persecution of the saints through 300? All right, so that's it from the notes. I know that you don't have them printed. From the notes from last week, that was what the intention was, to finish that. So this week we're going to go on to talk about early quote-unquote church fathers. So our goal today is to discuss Clement and his history a little bit, because out of all of there are four main, again, I hate using that phrase, church fathers. That's just the phrase that the religious community refers to them as. Out of all of them, these four are the ones that were either living parallel to the apostles and that first century church, or maybe they were in their teens in the 70s and 80s AD, so they certainly perhaps would have been exposed to the writings of the gospel in letter form. Certainly before John died, they would have been born. Those four in particular, these serve as what is said of them is often served as a foundational principle for which the Catholic Church says, this is why we do what we do, because Clement said, and Ignatius, there we go, Ignatius said, and we've got, there's two others as well that we'll talk about. So whether or not some of these things are true about these individuals, it's hard to know for sure, because some of their writings no longer exist. Some of the records, the historians that have written, like Tertullus, they recorded what they read in the writings of these individuals and what they claimed it meant. But some of these historians, like Tertullian, he didn't come on the scene until hundreds of years later. And so as a result, you got to figure that some of these people who claim, well, this is what Clement said, this is what Ignatius said, they may have been saying that only to justify the current belief structure. And of course, the Catholic Church coming into that structure starting around in the 300s, shortly after that great persecution is when really you start seeing the Catholic Church come on the scene. And after that is really when you have a lot of this accrediting these church fathers, quote unquote, with reinforcing the idea of a single bishop over each church, of the naming of Peter as the first pope of Rome, and so forth. That's when you really start seeing that come out. So, as I said, we're going to start with Clement. Clement's going to be one of the longer ones of our, that's why I'm the next, how long do we have? Next 20 minutes is just going to be for Clement. And then going forward into next week, we'll talk about Ignatius, and I forget the names of the other two, but I'll show you those in a second as well. And we'll talk about their writings. Again, Clement, we have the letter. He wrote, as far as we know, 2 letters, supposedly. There's other letters people claim he wrote, but historians and scholars say, no, those letters didn't come on the scene until later, and they're contradictory in some of their things that they claim versus what we know Clement wrote. So that being the case, Second Clement we no longer have. We have people who reference it, people who say this is what he said in it, but we don't have Second Clement. We do have First Clement. And out of all of the quote-unquote church fathers, again, I would say that Clement probably was a faithful Christian. Okay, everything that I can see, and I'm going to go through, I haven't fully read all of his actual letter. I've been looking for it online. I can get to it. I just haven't read it all yet because it's very, very long. In fact, it's twice the length of the letter to the Hebrews. So it's a long letter, and it's written to Corinth. I'm going to go through and just kind of see if there's anything that stands out as being contrary to what we know is taught in the gospel. But at least in the segments that I've seen, there's nothing there I disagree with. But what happens is, especially if you look up on Wikipedia or some of these other places about Clement, certain things get ascribed to him. Not that he said that, but that that's how it's interpreted in the filter of Catholicism. So a lot of times when they say, well, Clement mentioned Pope Peter, he didn't say Pope Peter. That's not what he said. That's he's referencing Peter. Well, Peter was the Pope, so he's talking about Pope Peter. So keep in mind when we go through this that some of the things that are ascribed to him is being ascribed through the filter of Catholicism. And the second thing is some of the wordage of this, I'm borrowing it straight out of the source. So like, for instance, on number 2, Pope Clement I, I'm not calling him the Pope. This is why he's called Pope Clement I, because another Pope came on the scene later, Pope, and he was Clement II, and so forth. So I'm not in any way saying he's a pope. This is just for our notes purposes. This is why he's called this and considered this. Okay, so talking about Clement of Rome. His epistle, 1 Clement, which was written around 96, which would have put it generally in the same area as Revelation, Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, was copied and widely read in the early church. Clement calls on the Christians of Corinth to maintain harmony and order. It is the earliest Christian epistle aside from the New Testament, at least as far as what we have. Not to say there weren't others written. I'm sure that there were perhaps letters written by Timothy and by Titus and different letters to different churches, but at least in terms of what we have outside of the New Testament and outside of absolute inspiration of the Holy Spirit, for sure, is the epistle of 1 Clement. So-called Pope Clement I, he died at age 99, also known as Saint Clement of Rome, is listed by Irenaeus and Tertullian as they put the Bishop of Rome. He may have been a bishop or an elder in Rome, holding office from 88 until his death in 99. He is considered to be the first apostolic father of the church. Again, first apostolic father of the church. One of the 3 chief ones, together with Polycarp and Ignatius of Antioch. So you've got Polycarp, that was one of the 4 also, and there's another fellow, I think, whose name starts with a P as well, that we'll see here in just a minute. These names are kind of weird. But Polycarp, Ignatius, and Clement were 3 of the 4 that were considered the first apostolic father. And the reason they call them apostolic fathers is not that they were apostles, but that as far as the Catholic Church was concerned, they can ascribe them as having been with or having known or having preached and helped the apostles. They were somehow connected to the apostles. Not that they were apostles or that they were made apostles like the next generation apostles. They were just connected to them somehow. While Clement is traditionally identified as a pope, there is no evidence for monarchical bishops in Rome at such an early date. Keep in mind, it wasn't until around the 300s AD that you started having this more organized clergy, more organized structure, more commonly associated with what we know as the Catholic Church. This epistle, or the epistle, is addressed as the Church of God which sojourneth in Rome to the Church of God which sojourneth in Corinth. Its stylistic coherence suggests a single author, which, again, is attributed directly to Clement. In fact, there's very little dissension on that matter. I found that interesting that this is the church that sojourneth in Rome to the church that sojourneth in Corinth. And of course, Church of God is a phrase we find in the New Testament, as well as Church of Christ. We could call ourselves Church of God if it weren't for the attachment of the holiness type of attributes that people commonly think of when they think of the Church of God. So that's why we call ourselves the Church of Christ. Anything through 3 so far that we've talked about. We're going to talk more about this letter. In fact, I don't deal so much with Clement himself as I want to focus in on his writings, because it was these writings upon which the second century, third century Christians they based a lot of what they said and what they believed on those writings. So I want to focus on what we do know about the writings of these men. Yes, ma'am.
So, knowing absolutely nothing about this, just that phrase strikes me odd, that one church is writing to another church. I realize it's an individual
No, you're right.
saying it, but
Yeah.
that's just an odd thing.
It is.
Sometimes Paul would say, the members of the church are automatically
Right.
or whatever, but I mean, it was definitely a letter from Paul.
Yes.
That just strikes me.
Yeah, it does. And it's interesting because he gets involved in a dispute that's going on in Corinth. And if he were an elder in Rome, his oversight doesn't extend to Corinth. Now, as a Christian who may have known an apostle, for instance, if that was the basis of his writing it and so forth, you could see it that way. But yeah, wording it the way that he does, it's as if it's one church writing to another church, and of course we don't have that example in the New Testament anywhere. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Anything else through number 3? Number 4. Few details are known about Clement's life. Clement was said to have been consecrated by St. Peter. I don't know what that means. And he is known to have been a leading member of the church in Rome in the late 1st century. Again, he was considered an elder, at least an elder in Rome. The Liber Pontificalis states, I may not have pronounced that properly, Liber Pontificalis, whatever, states that Clement died in Greece in the 3rd year of Emperor Trajan's reign, or 101 AD. Okay, so when it says holding office from 88 till his death in 99, that should be 101. He died at age 99, so apologize. So around 101 AD is when he died, supposedly.
Death at age 99.
Yeah, he died at age 99. Yeah, he died. He was 99 years old in 101 AD, supposedly. All right, number 5. Early succession lists. Again, the Catholic Church has I've often said that the Catholic Church, if you look at the foundational principles of the Catholic Church, it seems like it was an extension of Galatians, where it was a mixture of Judaistic rite and ritual along with the concept of Christ and forgiveness of sins. And if you look at the Catholic Church, the idea of genealogies, lineages in the form of clergy was very important. And so this idea of succession lists to show continuity between popes, between bishops and clergy and so forth, that's very important to them. And again, that similarity to Judaism strikes me. But here in number 5, it says early succession lists name Clement as the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd successor of St. Peter. Nobody knows because there was no succession, but anyway. However, the meaning of his inclusion in these lists has been very controversial. There is no evidence for a monarchical episcopacy. Somebody say that word for me. Episcopacy? That sounds weird. In Rome at such an early date. There is also, however, no evidence of a change occurring in ecclesiastical organization until the latter half of the 2nd century, which would indicate that a new or newly monarchical, that word didn't establish itself until much later than traditionally thought. And this is straight out of the source as well. And some of these sources I'm getting from, some of you asked me, I'm going to include a bibliography at the end, bibliography, that's the right word, at the end of the notes, whatever notes we have. Some of this is coming from Wikipedia. Some of this is coming from Christianity.org. Some of this is coming from other sites that I'll give you. Some of it's coming from Fox's Books of Martyrs. Some of it's coming from, forget the name of the encyclopedia that I looked at. So it's just kind of a combination of sources, and I'm mainly looking for the stuff that is consistent in all the sources. Not just something somebody said and put it in Wikipedia. Something that's consistent among the sources so that at least we have a baseline for this is what generally is understood or held. So what I found interesting about this is the fact that there's no evidence of a change occurring in ecclesiastical organization, which is to say, the way churches were as of the 1st century. You had elders, you had deacons, and that was it. You didn't have an organizational structure of one bishop over an entire system, or for that matter, churches kind of all together leading up to Rome, where Rome would have been the home mother church or something like that. That's not how it worked. Okay? In fact, it wasn't until mid-2nd to 3rd centuries that you start seeing that starting to come about. Okay? There's no evidence. In fact, I thought that was great, that the meaning of his inclusion in these lists has been very controversial, because whatever source they're getting these lists from could just be listing the elders of that church, not necessarily listing the popes, or for that matter, the individuals who were single bishops, but that this is just a list of these are the elders that we've had. I don't see anything wrong with that, but then it's taken out of context hundreds of years later. So that's the point that the source is trying to make, is that there's no evidence that the interpretation that people are seeing here is accurate, because the early church didn't exist like that. It wasn't until the mid-2nd to 3rd century that you started having this hierarchical clergy, episcopacy, whatever. So anything through number 5. Again, I apologize if some of this is kind of dry. I'm trying to focus in on the stuff that would kind of mean the most to us as going forward, and this is setting us up to understand kind of the setting for why things happened later in the 200s and 300s AD for the establishment of the Catholic Church. And so covering these 4 men is really important, I think, to understand how people took what they think they said later. Number 6, starting in the 3rd and 4th century, tradition has identified him as the Clement that Paul mentioned in Philippians 4, verse 3, a fellow laborer in Christ. And it could be, given the fact that, Philippians 4, verse 3, he would have been around, probably around Paul's age during that period of time, if he really was born around 2 AD and lived till 99 AD, or 101 AD, and he was 99 years old. Philippians 4, verse 3, Paul, in the midst of that, talks about those who had been fellow laborers with him, and Clement is mentioned in verse 3 of Philippians chapter 4. So whether that's the same Clement, again, as of the 3rd and 4th century, 200 years after he died, they're attributing that to being him, whether it is or not, but at least we know there was a Clement who was a Christian, who was with Paul at one point. Thoughts through 6. Number 7, according to tradition, Clement was imprisoned under the Emperor Trajan. We've talked about him. During this time, he is recorded to have led a ministry among fellow prisoners. Thereafter, he was executed by being tied to an anchor and thrown into the sea. Leave it to the Caesars to get kind of... It's not like they can just kill them. They have to do all this, horrible ways in which they killed Christians. It was like, how creative can I be with the next set of Christians to kill? So when you read some of this stuff, and you ask yourself, why didn't he just kill him with a sword and be done with it? I think in a lot of ways they were trying to set an example. They were trying to make it as horrific and as what we would consider cruel and unusual as possible, so as to deter people from becoming Christians. So some of these Caesars who were trying to curb the tide, I think that's why they kind of came along with these weird and strange ways of killing people. Thoughts through number 7, and really that's as much as our notes for Clement himself. Okay, so focusing in on his writings. We've only got 5 minutes up. I don't know if I'll get through it all, but we'll finish it up next week if we have to. Clement's only existing genuine text is a letter to the Christian congregation at Corinth, often called the First Epistle of Clement or First Clement. The history of First Clement clearly and continuously shows Clement as the author of this letter. It is considered the earliest authentic Christian document outside the New Testament. The letter was written in response to a dispute in which certain bishops/presbyters, these would have been elders who were also preaching the gospel. That's kind of what they mean by bishops/presbyters, but that's we know in the New Testament that bishops, elders, shepherds, In fact, the idea of the presbytery or presbyter carries with it a sense of teaching the gospel. So that's why they have them listed that way. In which certain bishops/presbyters of the Corinthian church had been deposed. He asserted the authority of the bishop presbyters as rulers of the church on the ground that the apostles had appointed such. I have no problem with that. They are to rule, okay, but not lording over them, of course. That's what Peter told him in 1 Peter chapter 5, but certainly I don't have a problem with that. His letter, which is one of the oldest extant Christian documents outside the New Testament, was read in church or in the assembly, along with other epistles, some of which later became part of the Christian canon. When we talk about the Christian canon, that's actually what we have as being the letters of Paul, the letters of Peter, letters of John, Jude, James, so forth. The epistle mentions episcopi. That's one of the terms in the Greek we find in the New Testament regarding elders, overseers, bishops, or presbyteroi. I don't know, however the Greek pronounces that term. Elders or presbyters as the upper class of minister served by the deacons. When they say upper class of minister, what they mean is that you had two main offices in the early church in each congregation. You had elders and you had deacons. That was it. So in their parlance here, the upper class of, upper class of minister, it just means that was an official office that was held by these men as an elder. That's all they mean. Again, that's the wordage or the parlance in the filter of Catholicism, okay? Because it sounds very Catholic. But all it means is you had elders, you had deacons, and that's exactly what the New Testament tells us to have. But since it does not mention, so as he's writing, you have the upper class of ministers served by the deacons. I guess the deacons, it's not like they're slaves or something, but they are doing as the elders give them jobs to do. That's what that means. But since it does not mention himself, Clement doesn't refer to himself as anything. It gives no indication of the title or titles used for Clement in Rome. And that particular point is also used to speak against him as being pope, because the thought process was if he was pope, he would have said, I'm a pope, listen to what I'm telling you. He doesn't do that. He doesn't refer to himself as a pope. He doesn't refer to himself as an elder, even though that is attributed to him that he was. These works were the first to affirm the apostolic authority of the clergy. Again, that's the interpretation they have given the filter of what they think. Okay? They're based on the idea of clergy. Okay, technically by law and by society, I'm considered clergy because I'm a minister, I'm a preacher. But that doesn't make me an elder. Okay, what Clement seems to be addressing in his letter, he's addressing elders who were serving to teach the gospel, not evangelists in and of themselves, and certainly not some strange different hierarchy that was being established. So the way they're reading this is apostolic authority for the clergy. What he's really saying is apostolic authority for elders and deacons that the Catholic Church then borrowed and said, this is what we're going to do, and we have these writings that show that it's the right thing to do. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up here with number 2 next week. Again, I apologize for not having specific notes. I'll try to figure it out how to get it the most efficiently to all of you, and hopefully by Sunday you'll have something to be able to pick up and take home. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.